Leonardo's greatest gift to the modern photographer was the helicopter. He also told us how to light a portrait with simplicity and intentionality. In this video, we're going to go through Da Vinci's notes to see his personal formula for lighting and his tips on how to make a portrait stand out. We hear a lot of regurgitated information on practical lighting for portraits. Lighting can be so complicated because there are so many variables. I thought it would be interesting to go back to the source to see why some lighting patterns are so useful. Leonardo's lighting style tried to combat the inevitable analysis paralysis by using restraint and simplicity. His notebooks were his thesis on art and science. They're a portal into the master's methods at the end of the 15th century, when artists were beginning to view the world in a very photographic way. There aren't that many Da Vinci portraits left in circulation. In fact, you can count the number of individual portraits that are left on 3 hands. So bear that in mind when I make sweeping generalizations about his work. I tabulated the lighting patterns in his portraits, and it seemed that he used a very limited set of patterns. He used butterfly or loop lighting the most often. The only instance of Rembrandt lighting I could find was in one of Da Vinci's later works, the portrait of John the Baptist. It's a bit weird calling it Rembrandt lighting when it was painted 100 years before Rembrandt even picked up a brush. I'll come back to the significance of the lighting in the portrait later in the video. When I looked at Rembrandt's huge nest of portraits, he had a clear preference for lighting his subject from the left. But with Da Vinci, he's a little less picky about the direction of the light, though he did keep the light in the direction the sitter's facing. He's using short lighting most of the time. When it comes to Da Vinci's lighting preferences, one of his aims is to please the people who are commissioning his work. He states that you only really need one light, and that the light should fall upon the picture from one window only. During the day, the only natural light source is the sun, so you don't really have a say in the matter. He recognises that you can bounce light off a bright surface on the opposite side of the sitter, in the same way that you'd use a V-flat or a white wall in the studio. He calls it reverberation. Reverberation is caused by bodies of a bright nature with a flat and semi-opaque surface which, when the light strikes upon them, throw it back again, like the rebound of a ball to the former object. Reflected light lets you lighten the shadows caused by the main light without having to fiddle around with a second light source. Writing about flat light, Leonardo said, "When the eye is placed between the luminous body and the objects illuminated by it, these objects will be seen without any shadow. Shadows appear to me to be of supreme importance in perspective, because without them, opaque and solid bodies would be ill-defined." We really rely on the visual information given by shadows to acknowledge the three-dimensionality of an object. Objects seen in light and shade show in greater relief than those which are wholly in light or shadow. We need to avoid flat lighting then, according to Da Vinci, so we need to move it. What if we move it down? What would you think to that, Leonardo? Above all, see that the figures you paint are broadly lighted from above. You must know that if you saw your most intimate friend with a light from below, you'd find it difficult to recognize them. All right, okay, so let's move the light up then. With the light directly above the face, we get a little shadow under the nose, and that's called butterfly lighting. If we move the light or the face just a little bit from the light, the shadow goes beneath but to one side of the nose, and that's loop lighting. Both these patterns are very flattering because they don't show the small textures on the face, but they provide enough shadow to show that the face is three-dimensional. And that's the main reason why we avoid flat lighting. There's no shadow, things look two-dimensional like a cartoon. It's not what we want. Da Vinci goes out on a limb making a bold statement prescribing where the shadow should be on the face. He draws 2 rays of light on his diagram, one that leaves a shadow under the nose and the other just under the bottom lip. It's a butterfly pattern, and it's a bold proclamation by someone who breaks the rule himself on occasion. Da Vinci knows that a small light source will cause sharp shadows. A single and distinct luminous body causes stronger relief in the object than diffused light, and he warns against its use. Lights cast from a small window give strong differences of light and shade, all the more if the room lighted by it be large, and this is not good for painting. His preference then is obviously for a large diffused light. The difference between that and a small light is how quickly you go from shadow to highlight. Therefore, O painter, make your shadow darkest closer to the object that casts it, and make the end of it fading into light, seeming to have no end. Perfection. Or is it? He seems to have some warnings about large light sources too. A light which is smaller than the body it illuminates produces shadows of which the outline ends within the surface of the body, and not much compound shadow. A light which is larger than the body it illuminates falls on more than half of it and produces much compound shadow. In some ways, a large light can act like lots of small lights over a large area. It's easy to guess where the shadow from a bare speed light might fall, but from a strip box it's not so clear, especially because there could be a hot spot in the centre where the bulb is, and dimmer light at the very top and bottom of the diffusion panel. In fact, he even had specific advice for strip softboxes. A luminous body which is long and narrow in shape gives more confused outlines to the derived shadow than a spherical light. So I guess we need to be careful with them. Da Vinci's really particular in where he wants his light positioned. In general, he states that the height of the light should be so arranged as that every object shall cast a shadow on the ground of the same length of itself. Here's an example with the results of that calculation. The person in the portrait is 5.5 feet tall, so if I want the light 5.5 feet away from them, it has to be 11 feet in the air. That's really high off the ground. And I wonder if that's why Da Vinci has a lot of his sitters sitting down. Maybe that's why they're called sitters in the first place. When they're sitting down, they're closer to 4.5 feet tall, so the light only needs to be 9 feet from the ground. That's a bit more manageable. The critical thing here is to have the light 45 degrees up and in line with the nose of the sitter. If it's a bit off to the left or right, that's fine. It just becomes a loop rather than a butterfly pattern. But Da Vinci rarely moves his light so far off axis that it becomes a Rembrandt light. Da Vinci's got a couple of tricks up his sleeve to add some extra relief to his portraits. If you've looked at a lot of paintings and photographs, you're probably aware of these already. To increase the relief of a picture, you may place between your figure and the solid object on which the shadow falls a line of bright light dividing the figure from the object in the shadow. So this first technique he suggests is adding a rim light from behind. This prevents the shadow of the face from blending in with a dark background. I've made a couple of portraits myself where I've made that mistake, and a simple rim light would have made it better. The second technique is to add light to the background rather than the sitter. Always contrive to arrange the figures against the background in such a way as that the parts in shadow are against a light background and the illuminated portions against a dark background. This is a classic checkerboard pattern where we get relief on both the highlight and the shadow part of the face by having the opposite lighting pattern on the background. I didn't find a fantastic example of a Da Vinci portrait with this technique, but there are plenty of other Renaissance artists who use the checkerboard pattern to great effect. I find it really amazing how a master artist, whether they're a painter or a photographer, can use lighting patterns so intentionally. The painting Salvator Mundi shows Christ holding a glass sphere. It's clear that Da Vinci understood optics well enough to know that the light would be distorted when it passes through the sphere. So the intention there, I'd assume, is the message that there are no distortions in the world when it's in Christ's hands. The lighting on the face doubles down on this message. The face is pointing neither to the left nor the right, it's central. The eyes are centered, and the butterfly shadow under the nose tells us that the light is in the middle as well. It's directly behind the painter and above his head. Nothing is turned, nothing is twisted. It's calm, central, and in control. In the painting of John the Baptist, the only one I found with a Rembrandt pattern, the light is above the subject, but pushed really far to the left-hand side. Maybe Leonardo thought John knew where the light should be positioned, and the gesture in the painting is pointing to the right place. Rembrandt lighting got its name because Rembrandt used that pattern so often. Butterfly lighting's often called paramount lighting because it was used by the film studio photographers less than 100 years ago. In contrast, Leonardo da Vinci precisely prescribed his lighting pattern in his manuscripts more than half a millennium ago. So maybe calling it Da Vinci lighting would bring us a little closer to its origin.